Thank you very much for the kind introduction, and thank you very much, Hassan and Jamil, for attending, and thank you for an audience for staying around. I know this is the last main session in the hall today, and this is around lunchtime, so
Yeah.
we're gonna try and keep this very casual here for the next session, because we have a lot to unpack. So if we look at the actual title for the topic, financing the future, building a sustainable capital stack, it's quite a meaty conversation to begin with. So I think the key thing for this session is the sustainability sector is at the forefront of innovation. We all understand that for startups, for SMEs to survive, grow, that there has to be the right sort of financial models in place in order to support the development of these entities. So this is going to be a 30-minute free chat. We're going to discuss how we can build a well-structured capital stack in order to support the startup and SME sector. With that, I am delighted to introduce my panel. We have Dr. Hassan Al-Abu Ghadar and
right.
Mr. Jamil Wine. So I think rather than me butcher your introductions, I'd like the both of you to introduce yourselves. Talk a bit about your roles, and then we'll start a question and answer session or a conversation.
Yeah.
So, Hassan?
Yeah, so thank you, Dr. Wayne, and Assalamu alaikum, everybody. I first want to thank the organizers in Rydia and MIWA for organizing such an excellent and an important event. So my background is I am a water treatment specialist. I have been focusing for the last few years on developing technologies from the ground up, from the idea stage, all the way into commercialization. The topic, as you said, it's very important, especially in the local sphere, and I think we all know venture capital investment is the key driver of technologies and innovation. Mm-hmm. We see it in sustainability sector and other sectors as well. And I know that I sit next to an esteemed panelist that have expertise and know-how in this area much more than myself, but I would like to share with the audience here my observation on the local aspect of the hurdles facing startup and SMEs here in Saudi in the sustainability sector. Now, if I want to categorize these hurdles, I can simply categorize them into two main areas: funding and regulations. When it comes to regulations, in the past few years, we SMEs and businesses here in Saudi have been facing a constantly evolving regulatory environment in the sustainability sector. While the government have been doing outstanding and significant strides in this area, establishing rigorous regulations that will help grow the sector, the challenge is that still we haven't achieved this regulatory maturity in the sustainability sector. And this can cause really complexity and problems with especially smaller businesses to adapt and comply with these changing regulations. However, with any challenges, there are opportunities, business opportunities. And one example I can think of is a promising Saudi startup that utilize generative AI to help these businesses comply with these changing regulations. So they provide some kind of assistant, digital assistant, to really keep these businesses up to speed in terms of compliance and keep them competitive in the sustainability sector. So that's mainly the, I would say, the regulation challenge. When it comes to the funding challenge, in this region, it's no secret. We have scarcity in venture, and I'm sure Mr. Wayne would attest to that, into investment and venture firms specializing in ESG here in this region. And what this makes it quite difficult to startup and companies to go and reach out to other investors, trying to convince them of their sustainability solutions and innovations and the long-term value of these things. And I can attest to this challenge through my experience as a specialist, technology specialist in water treatment. We all know water is the, I would say, the prime pillar of the sustainability business. Without water, I mean, we don't have any sustainable, let's say, business. And providing technologies that will ensure we have an alternative sustainable water resource is a great enabler. Now, to develop these technologies, you have to go, through my experience, and I've seen that working with companies like Aramco and other companies, we have to go through rigorous stages of starting with idea, then lab scale, bench scale, piloting, demonstration, deployment, and all the way to demonstration. This takes time and significant resources. Now, private equities, they don't have the appetite to wait for 10 plus years to really reap the benefits and returns of these technologies. And that's why, just from a non-expert point of view, I'm mostly from the technical point of view, that's why I think we definitely need a different approach when it comes to funding sustainability technology solutions to really reap the benefit of it. And this could be a top approach, could be a hybrid thing with the collaboration from government, universities, and the private sector. Okay. Maybe I talked a little bit more than I should, but this is just my take on this.
No, so I think one of the key things that we wanted to do at the start was really sort of kind of identify, right, what are the main pain points, and you've identified quite a few in terms of what are the funding gaps. So Jamil, do you want to introduce yourself, and again from your perspective, like, you know, what are the main challenges faced by startups and SMEs? I suppose Hassan has talked about the local context in terms of Saudi Arabia. Maybe you could broaden that out more in terms of, you know, other examples that you see in an international context.
No, absolutely, and thank you very much, Dr. Manis, Dr. Hassan. Great to be on a panel with both of you, and also just to echo what you said earlier, thank you very much to Miwa, Uridia, COP16 for having us. So I'm co-founder of a company called Riffle Ventures. We launched last year at COP in Dubai, and our mission is to work in a lot of ways with kind of the issues that we're going to be talking about on the panel today, right? Where the process of taking a concept that is going to contribute in some way to net zero goals or building resilience and adaptation capabilities is quite long, quite daunting, challenging, et cetera. Kind of how do we shorten that timeline? How do we bring other players into the picture so that you are reducing that timeline and obviously realizing impact and returns along the way? So you know, very aligned with, I think, a lot of the themes here. And we do that globally, right? So I'm based in the US, my partners as well, but we work kind of across the globe, have activity in multiple continents outside of the US as well. And I think that the way to maybe articulate the challenges that we're facing when it comes to it, I mean, it's, you know, sustainability and climate technology are quite broad themes, right? And, you know, when I was first entering this space People used to think about sustainability in terms of conservation, recycling, et cetera. And now we're realizing that climate and sustainability kind of touches everything in the economy, right? So it can be difficult to wrap a certain investment strategy around that, right? Because you have different types of assets, hardware, software, et cetera, that they grow at different speeds. They have different risk-return profiles. Some of them are much more R&D intensive, other are much already more commercialized and ready for the market. So you know, it can be a little bit difficult to put a common wrapper around all of it. But for sake of conversation, we can run through like a bit of a case study here. So you all might not know this, but cement, right? So cement that is kind of omnipresent in our world is, if you were to calculate the amount of carbon emissions that come from producing cement, it would equal the size of kind of the third largest country in terms of emissions in the world, right? So a massive amount of carbon emissions comes from cement. So when we look at high impact climate technology investments, cement in particular gets a lot of attention, right? And rightfully so. And so point being here is that to create, though, the solutions that are going to be needed to replace the current assets that we use in cement production, we have to almost take a completely different mindset when it comes to investing and waiting for returns, because in the time it might take us to actually back a green cement company, and I've invested in a couple myself, you're looking at maybe 5 years in a laboratory, right? Of just getting that formula right. It's a science project at that point, right? It's not even a company, right? Yes. Then it comes into the market, right? And then in maybe 2 to 3 years after that, you have a pilot production facility. In 3 to 4 years after that, that pilot product facility has graduated into a formal production, kind of fully commercialized, producing cement at a high clip, and active buyers coming in to actually purchase the material, right? Then that cement has to last for about 30, upwards of 50 years, right? We don't want to be using cement to build our infrastructure in the economy with the expectation that we're going to have to replace it every couple of years, right? So you're looking at a multi-decade kind of waiting period to figure out if this thing is going to stand the test of time, right? We've gotten spoiled as investors by the software period, where in that same amount of time, you can have about 5 to 10 unicorns created, many IPOs in that amount of time, right? Average, it takes about 5. If you look at IPOs in the software tech sector, it takes about 5 to 7 years on average for those to get to become a unicorn into IPO. In the same amount of time, that cement company hasn't even made it into the market officially yet, right? So it's a completely different mindset that we have to be using, right? And so before we even get into the financial instruments that are going to be needed to fund this, Dr. Hassan, you're talking about venture capital. Venture capital is critical in this. Even before the venture capitalists come into the picture, we've had to kind of rethink the way that we build companies, right? And I think that is also really critical here. And the other thing I'd bring in is also, when we talk about the sustainability capital stack, it wouldn't be a capital stack if we don't have buyers at the other end, right? We can only pump so much cash into companies for so long. There has to be a buyer eventually. Yeah. The market is ultimately, the investor is just a middleman between the builder and the buyer, right? If the buyer's not there, we don't have a market, right? So that's another critical element here. And if we're not teaching companies to build for the market, it's going to be very difficult to have any type of sustainable capital stack.
So your example is it's a very interesting one, because I don't want to have a conversation about concrete. This is a heavy enough conversation as it is. But very interestingly, Saudi Arabia, we import most of our sand for construction. Most of the sand here is so fine that it can't be used within the construction process. So one of our professors and a very astounded architect come up with a process in terms of aggregating the sand together in order to make construction sand from Saudi sand. So the process itself involves a calcification process, so it actually captures carbon in the process. But this is another conversation for afterwards. But that sustainable process, the net reduction in terms of CO2, in terms of our sand coming from Australia, is astronomical alone. So it's but we can have a conversation afterwards about that.
Hold you to it.
So. We talked a bit about the gaps in terms of where there's funding gaps. I suppose from the various different examples that you have, what are mechanisms that we could utilize here in the kingdom, in the region, and wider in order to sort of kind of look at, is it public-private, is it public-private academia? What sort of role does corporate need to play in terms of supporting these activities? So Hassan.
Go first, Hassan?
So I know for a fact that the alternative approach that we talked about has to be some kind of a hybrid approach, more than one organizations being involved at different stages of the startup in terms of funding, in terms of support. I know Wayne have looked at this at maybe at a more of a global scale, and I'm not sure what is the right formula here in Saudi, but definitely we need more investment, more awareness when it comes to ESG in general, sustainability, but also a more top-down approach to really incentivize these investment firms, universities, to start with for example, low TRL level, starting at the universities or big R&D centers that big companies can afford, like Aramco or SABIC, and then really helping them out through the especially when it comes to the piloting demonstration stage for these sustainability solutions takes time and takes these are most of these solutions are quite complex engineering solutions. We can't really expect a quick return, and we need to achieve a level of de-risking enough to allow for commercialization. This can span for years. The question is, what is the right formula to keep these startup and companies afloat until they reach the positive return, which is a few years down the line? But I'm interested to hear what's your take on this, and what's your recommendation as well.
No, I think you actually, I was going to repeat a little bit of what you said there. I think you're already on the way to answering it. So I think, let's take a company, and like a very common kind of sector or type of technology in the climate investment space is battery technology, right? So batteries used to, particularly store energy, right? And oftentimes people say that the quote unquote winners in the kind of EV adoption and renewable energy space are going to be ones that can kind of master the art of energy storage, right? Because we need to find ways not just to capture it and use it, but also to hold on to it for as long as possible so that we can use it, subsequently into the future, et cetera. And so to build better battery storage, right, at the beginning of that effort, right, if you were to take a group of researchers at KAUST, right, or a group of researchers at MIT, or a group of researchers in Aramco, right, like whatever it is, somebody has to take a bet on them at the beginning to say that I am going to give you enough financial runway to run your experiments, right? To do the research to figure out if we have a thing here worth even considering commercializing. So the conversation there, back to Dr. Hassan's point, it's not really about a return on investment at that point. It's, can this thing even function theoretically, right? Which is a grant, right? There's no way of getting around it. It's going to have to be technically free money that does not have a return associated with it, right? And we just have to say it out loud, even though we live in a society that wants to generate return. I mean, as much as I love to as well, we have to be comfortable with the fact that a large part of this is going to be parting with capital that we will not ever get back, right?
Yep.
And so somebody has to be willing to take that bet, or a group of entities has to be willing to take that bet. Once you get it to a point where you can start to consider commercialization, that's where, in theory, a VC that is, and not just any VC, right, but one that has limited partners backing it, that are comfortable with saying, look, I know that this is going to be very risky, that we may not be getting our returns back anytime soon. I am willing to take that bet, and I'm willing to part with my 500K into your fund, or my 5 million into your fund, so that you can deploy it into the innovators and builders that you trust, right? But then they're giving you that capital because they also think that you can help make a market out of it, right? And so after a certain point, and this is where I think the software era, again, has kind of conditioned us into thinking that we can keep investing and eventually the market will appear itself, right? It's get as many users as possible onto your platform and eventually the business model will click, right? We don't necessarily have that same luxury this time around. So strategic investors, not just limited partners that have a lot of capital, but strategic investors that have a vested interest in, say, the battery industry, in the cement industry, in the built environment, right? That's the kind of group that's, I think, going to push the ball forward because they can help make that market possible. They can bring in talent, right? So I think a group like Aramco is very kind of uniquely positioned to say, like, you know who the buyers are in this space, right? It's not just about the investors and the researchers, but it's who is going to come in and eventually buy this thing from you. The other thing, too, is that there's going to be project finance at the end of the day, too, which usually the venture capital space has not interacted a lot with the project finance world, right? It has a different risk-return profile. VC is built to take many, many shots on goal. They use the portfolio approach to bring in the returns. Project finance is going to say, I'm going to take a couple shots on goal because I know that the assets underlying this company are going to work and return capital. It's a very, very different mindset. The thing here is that we've said grants, VC, project finance, all have to be coming to the same table, which is a very unique formula. We haven't really seen a lot of in recent years. And so that means that these three groups, amongst others, have to know how each other behave. They have to be developing some type of consensus from day one and working very closely together. Yeah. Otherwise, we're going to be putting a lot of companies out into the market that are not going to be around for very long, unfortunately.
So I'm going to add another complication, and where does government come into play in this? You know, so if we look at some of the, the long-term projects, Couston, the Ministry for Environment, Water and Agriculture had announcement around an international water centre. We have a lot of water research at Coast, and we know that these are long-term investments, and that they will have a huge impact in terms of the GDP for the kingdom and for other countries across the world. So how does the government sort of kind of play in that mix in order to help facilitate these types of investments?
And my take on this is you know that it has to be a top-down approach. The government has to play a role. You can't rely on the business's, let's say, moral compass to really drive the sustainability alone. Yes, it will have a factor, but again, when we want to shift into more alternative sustainable solutions when it comes to water, food, etc., the existing solution, we spend years developing them. So coming up with an alternative will not be in a couple of years or 3 years. It will take time. It is quite complex. So how can you really incentivize companies, SMEs to really try and tap into these alternative solutions, to come up with the new solutions? I feel that definitely you have to have some kind of paradigm shift when it comes to investment. Yeah. I don't know how, but I know that we definitely need some kind of a shift.
No, I think I like what you said there, Dr. Hassan, in terms of we can't really let altruism drive progress here, right? There's always going to be some first movers that have the luxury of thinking a little bit more ambitiously, creatively, et cetera, but to bring the entire market with you, you need to have a very strong kind of push and pull mechanism, or set of push and pull mechanisms set in place. Let's think about the government role along a few lines. So in the U.S. in particular, you may not know this, but the biggest climate tech, early stage climate tech investor in the U.S. by a long shot is the National Science Foundation, which is backed by the U.S. government, right? So if you were to take them out of the equation, not only would a significant amount of early stage climate tech companies not be getting funding, but a lot of follow-on investors that then come on to back those same companies would also not have a lot to invest in, right? Yeah. So before we even talk about a Series B, C, D gap, which we often talk about, you actually have to fill that 0 to 1 gap, right? So government funding, at least in the US, has been really critical to that. So there's already a funding kind of role that the government plays that very few entities can play in general, right? You would have to create an enormous philanthropic initiative which I don't know if there's a high net worth an individual out there that's capable of filling that gap on their own, right? So the funding is one point. The other is helping, as I said earlier, to shape the market, right? In the US, we use something sometimes called advanced market commitments, and you see those used not just around sustainability and climate, but in other sectors, right? So around COVID, government said we are going to purchase X number of vaccines. That creates an incentive for the pharmaceuticals of the world to start actually creating these vaccines, right? So it is for the government to come and say, in advance of you building it, I'm going to put an order in for them. That will incentivize creation, right? So that means they're not relying on demand from individual consumers to drive it, or altruism in this case. They're saying, no, I'm going to foot the bill, right? So you know that there's a buyer waiting on the other end, right? The other is talent development, right? At the end of the day, if you don't have the human capital to build these things, but also to fund these things, right? Because it's a technical skill set to invest, right? It's not just about looking at deals and pitch decks and saying, great, here's some money. Like, you have to have certain level of awareness in the risk that you're taking as an investor, and these investors, they have fiduciary responsibility to report back to people that gave them the money that they're managing. So there's a talent component in this as well. The government is instrumental in helping to shape the kind of framework, which I'm sure both of you know better than most people, around incentivizing people to learn certain things, right? So is there, a question here for any country is like, do you have a taxonomy in place that your Ministry of Labor is using to guide decisions around, let's say, green talent or sustainability talent, right? If you don't have that, you're basically, to go back to Dr. Hassan's point, you're kind of relying on people's altruism and general curiosity, which when we look at the urgency of the goals sitting in front of us, we can't really rely on just urgency alone to help people feel compelled to learn these things. You have to train people en masse. In this panel I was on a few moments ago, one of the panelists talked about in Jordan needing to create 1 million jobs around sustainability or green jobs. That doesn't happen organically, right? Somebody has to come in and say, we're pulling a lever to make this happen tomorrow, and there's only so many players in the world that can do that. Governments, last thing I'll say is signaling power, right? Bill Gates established Breakthrough Energy. It helps signal a certain amount of activity in the green investment and climate investment sector. The Inflation Reduction Act comes in on the US. That sends a signal that no other entity in the United States can signal, right? That has such an enormous amount of symbolic power that only, again, a government can do.
Yeah. So, and I think the thing that we're really touching upon here is, like, we need a full ecosystem, so we have our hosts, the Research Development and Innovation Authority. I know they're a very young organization. Them and the Ministry for Environment, Water and Agriculture are helping to look and develop that ecosystem within the kingdom. And I suppose we can use this last couple of minutes maybe just to talk about ecosystems and how important, having that ecosystem, building and maintaining that ecosystem over, a period of 10, 20, 30 years is really, really impactful in terms of supporting a thriving economy. So, Hassan?
Yeah. Could you just repeat that question?
So it's all about ecosystems, and having that whole combination of, when we started this conversation, it was really around financing, but it deviated towards financing plus talent, plus policy, plus, in order to sort of kind of support where we go next.
So I can maybe share my experience when it comes to developing technologies for Aramco, water treatment technologies. And Aramco is a huge organization. The way they set up developing technologies, where we as a technology organization, we serve the client. The client means the operation in Aramco. So when it comes to the funding, comes from their bucket. And they funded, they sponsored the technology from early on, and that creates a synergy in making sure that we are developing the right technology and be at the right place at the right time. But that works within the same company. For outside, for startup in in Saudi, working with government agencies and also private sector, my experience through a couple of companies that I'm actually invested in, startup companies, is we have seen, especially in the last few years, really big strides and big advancement in the kingdom in establishing this ecosystem. Establishing hubs to support startup from early stages and provide them the resources and even sometimes the right connections for clients and demands in order for them to grow organically until they can stand on their feet.
So just to complement what Dr. Hassan has said here, let's use an example of a company, right? I think if you can follow the journey of a company that has been successful, you can get an appreciation for what the surrounding ecosystem should look like, right? I know we're out of time, so I'll try to talk fast. We could take a company like Tesla, right? Tesla or BYD, right? Mm-hmm. Before that company existed, there were decades of research, right, that went into EVs, right? To use a sports term, I think I might have used it a second ago, but there were shots on goal by orders of magnitude that we probably don't appreciate, right? Because corporations, governments, universities like KAUST, et cetera, were funding research on electric vehicles, right? It was a science project for many, many years. Yeah. So one big element of these ecosystems is going to have to be research, right? Research takes money, it takes talent, it takes laboratories and facilities, et cetera. Even before that thing that is now called Tesla or BYD or Rivian or whatever you want to call it existed, it was a series of research projects, right? And the people that touched those were engineers and researchers and students and corporate executives and probably government officials at some point too that were providing funding to incentivize that research to be done. So before we even knew these things existed, there was this own ecosystem around academia that was enabling that idea to just be explored, right? Once it became a company, right? And, we all know Elon Musk. Once it was starting to be commercialized and turned into a company and grown into the marvel that is Tesla today, we would be shocked if we were to look at the capitalization table of that company to see how many different investors have put money into that, right? Mm-hmm. Which means that you were engaging high net worth individuals and venture capital funds and philanthropies and the US government, right? A host of different types of capital providers are taking a gamble essentially at that point and saying, I believe in this. I believe in this person. I believe in this technology. I think this is critical for the future. I'm going to back it, right? But then those investors are represented by other investors, right? Limited partners, right, that are putting money in. So you have a whole network of limited partners behind the scenes that we don't know who they are, right? I mean, obviously, it's not like they're mysterious individuals, but we just, they're not going to necessarily being recognized in the same way that the person managing that capital is, right? So you have that too, right? You have legions of engineers, lawyers, marketers, right? This host of talent that is on a daily basis helping to convert these kind of, not to sound overly simplified, but these dreams into a reality here, right? And so if we were to kind of look under the hood of any of these companies, we'd realize that it's so much more complex than just saying a technology, an investor, and a buyer. There's so many individuals behind the scenes that contribute to these things, and if you were to take them out of the equation, a lot of these things wouldn't exist, right? And so for us to want, and I think we're all talking here in the interest of making sure that these things don't just exist but stay in the market for as long as possible, right? That outlast us. And for that to come to fruition, there needs to be an ecosystem approach. If that doesn't happen, none of this is going to have any staying power. Right? So.
Okay, thank you very much. Our clock went from white to red, so I think they're really pushing to get us off the stage. Possible, yeah. Thank you very much, gentlemen. A wonderful conversation. Jamil, I think you ended the conversation on the right note in terms of this is a very complex thing, and it takes time. I think it takes multiple, it takes time, it takes patience, and it takes, it takes years in order to deliver on a lot of the things. And I suppose the thing is you have to hold strong, I think, and provide multiple types of funding for various different stages, as well as having the right partners and the right incentives from government. So please join me in thanking my guests,
Thank you.
and thank you for staying and joining this conversation.
Appreciate it. Thank you.